Hi! Good day, Ma'am Elinita Cortez. I am Norkaiza Hajini Abdulajid from BSAD English Section 2A. For this video, I will going to explain the week 4 or Module 4. So first is, what is genre? Genre, a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content, a classical of the Gothic novel genre. Next is, what are the 5 major genres of children literature? I will going to explain each. First is, picture books are usually written for very young children who are learning to read. These books include thickly constructed board books for very young children, concept books such as those that teach the alphabet, counting, or basic reading skills, and simple illustrated books that are read to children to expose them to the language and the art of reading. Next is, traditional literature for children varies. Next is, traditional literature for children varies widely and is perhaps the most loosely defined genre, because selections might overlap into the general fiction category. Next is, poetry and verse. Poetry and verse literature includes the epic poem, narrative poem, dramatic poem, lyric and sonnet, among others. Rhyming literature is popular with very young children, as seen in the Carriage Nursery Rhyme and Fables favorites Mother Goose, Jack and Jill, and Little Miss Muffet. Next is, biographies and autobiographies for children are usually meant to inspire young people or educate them while providing entertainment. Next is, fiction and non-fiction comprise the widest variety of literature for children. Modern fantasy and science fiction stories have become extremely popular with children. Generally, modern fantasy is characterized by time travel, imaginary characters and animals, or inanimate objects that talk. Next is, what is fantasy? Differentiate between high fantasy and low fantasy. So what is this? Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction involving magical elements, typically set in a fictional universe, and sometimes inspired by mythology and folklore. So that is the fantasy. So high and low fantasy are the 2 main categories of fantasy. High fantasy refers to epic fantasy, which is set in an alternate world. It typically includes lots of magical elements, fantastical creatures, and unusual technology. When magical creatures and elements intrude upon the regular world. That is the low fantasy and high fantasy. Next is, what are the types of fantasy stories? Define each. So I will going to define each. First is, portal fantasy. A fantasy where characters travels from the real world into a fictional fantasy world, often through a portal or gateway. Next is, urban fantasy. So what is urban fantasy? Contemporary fantasy. Urban fantasy can be tricky to define as it has been used in many different ways, often interchangeably with other fantasy subgenre terms such as low fantasy and paranormal fantasy. Next is, fantasy romance. A fantasy romance is a high fantasy in which romance is a core element. Some people use the term to refer to any fantasy story with a romantic plot. Next is, children fantasy. So, a children fantasy is sometimes called a juvenile fantasy. as one primarily aimed at the children, usually with child protagonists. Sometimes novels are considered to be both YA fantasies and children's fantasies, particularly if they appeal to an age group that bridge late childhood and the early teenage years. Next is heroic fantasy. So what is heroic fantasy? A fantasy in sword and sorcery are terms used to refer to high fantasy stories that focus primarily on swashbuckling heroes, swordplay, exciting battles, and violent conflicts. Next is what is science fiction. So I will going to explain the science fiction. Fiction based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social and environmental change. So frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets. That is the environmental change. Next is what is historical fiction. Historical fiction is set in a real place during a culturally recognizable time. The details in the action in the story can be a mix of actual events and ones from the author's imagination as they fill in the gaps. Characters can be pure fiction or based on a real people. Often it's both. Next is what is realistic fiction. Realistic fiction creates imaginary characters and situations that depict our world and society. It focuses on themes of growing up and confronting personal and social problems. This genre portrays characters coming to understand themselves and others. Next is what are the types of realistic fiction? So, realistic fiction is divided into two parts, historical and contemporary fiction. First is historical fiction. Takes place in a time remote enough to be considered history rather than contemporary fiction, which takes place today or in the recent past. And for the next is picture books. A picture book combines visual and verbal narratives in a book format, most often aimed at young children, with the narrative told primarily through text. They are distinct from comics, which do so primarily through sequential image. And for the next is what are the types of multicultural literature? I will going to explain. Multicultural literature includes books and portray people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. So first is African and American. Literature can be defined as writings by people of African descent living in the United States. It is highly varied. So Native American is literature reflects the culture, history, and contemporary issues of the people who are indigenous to what is now in the United States. So next is Asian American literature. As the body of literature produced in the United States by writers of Asian descent, Asian American literature became a category during the 1970s but didn't see a direct impact in viewership until later in the 1970s. Next is Latino literature. It's literature with writing by a people of Latin American ancestry, often but not always in English, most notably by Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, and Dominican Americans, many of whom were born in the United States. Next is what are the samples of children's poetry books? So, Where the Sidewalk Ends, A Child's Garden of Verses, Revolting Rims, Falling Up Light in the Attic, Life Doesn't Threaten Me, and One Leaf Rides the Wind. What are the fables? A fable is a story that features animals, plants, or forces of nature, which are anthropomorphized, given human qualities. A fable always ends with a normal lesson. Next is, what are myths? Myths are stories that are based on tradition. Some may have factual origins, while others are completely fictional. But myths are more than mere stories, and they serve a more profound purpose in Asian and modern cultures. Next is, what are legends? A legend is a genre of folklore that consists of a narrative feature, human action, belief, or perceived both by teller or listeners to have taken place in human history. Next is, what are the tales? A tall tale is a story with unbelievable elements related as if it were true and factual. Next is, what are realistic tales? It is a genre consisting of stories that could have actually occurred to people or animals in a believable setting. These stories resemble real life, and fictional characters within these stories react similarly to real people. What are folk tales? Folk tales are stories in the oral tradition or tales that people tell each other out loud rather than stories in written form. They are closely related to many storytelling traditions, including fables, myths, and fairy tales. So, next is, what are trickster? Trickster tales is new for me. So, it is an oral tradition worldwide. A story featuring a protagonist who has magical powers and who is characterized as a compendium of opposites. Next is, what are noodlehead stories? Noodlehead tales are folk tales that involve a well-intended individual that often lacks common sense. At times, they may take words too literally, and the responses typically lead to very foolish actions. The humor is always gentle in nature, which makes the stories enjoyable for all. Next is, what are mother ghost stories? Dan Leno created a poor woman who befriends a magical ghost that provides her with golden eggs. She is rich, but there is something she wants more than money. She wants to be young and beautiful. The Patumin has a strong moral beauty and wealth, cannot bring your happiness. And that's all for the week 4 module. Thank you for listening.